Welcome to HardScript.
Help me reach 5,000 subscribers. Support the video with a like and leave your thoughts in the comments. She said it like it was a principle she'd learned in a seminar, not a sentence meant to cut. Touch is earned, not owed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look angry. She said it calmly, from the other side of the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone while I stood there holding a glass I hadn't taken a sip from. I remember thinking how strange it was that a marriage could be reduced to a policy. My name is Michael Reed, 44, corporate security and compliance. I make a living thinking about second-order effects, invisible consequences, the kind of damage that doesn't show up until months later when it's too late to undo it. I don't argue much. I don't react fast. I observe. Claire used to say that was one of the things she admired about me. That night, she explained her rule without looking at me. Intimacy, she said, required emotional alignment. Respect. Support. She said lately I'd been distant. Not engaged enough in her work. Not enthusiastic about her projects, her clients, her trajectory. She didn't accuse. She diagnosed. I nodded once. Not because I agreed, but because I understood what was happening. Claire was a director of business development at a consulting firm that lived on optics. Dinners, conferences, introductions that looked casual but were anything but. She was always deciding who sat where, who got access, who had to wait. I knew that world. I'd audited versions of it my entire career. What I hadn't realized was that I'd been moved into the waiting area. I didn't argue. I didn't negotiate. I finished my water and went to bed early. That's what I do when something doesn't make sense yet. I give it time to explain itself. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, her phone lit up on the counter while she was in the shower. A name I didn't recognize. Evan Brooks. A preview line cut through the steam and the distance she thought she'd created. Looking forward to seeing you tonight. Thanks again for going to bat for me. Evan was a startup founder. One of her clients. I'd heard the name before, always in the context of leverage. Promising, but fragile. Dependent on her introductions. Her word. That's when the sentence she'd given me finally finished forming. Touch is earned, not owed. I realized then it wasn't a boundary. It was a demonstration. And I wasn't the only man in the room. I didn't confront her. That would have turned it into a debate, and debates create noise. Noise gives people cover. Instead, I started paying attention to timing. Claire's calendar used to be something we shared by habit, not necessity. Dinners marked in vague blocks. Conferences labeled by city. Client meetings stacked back to back like chess moves. After Evan's name appeared on her phone, I noticed how often his time seemed to orbit hers. Late meetings that didn't need to be late. Drinks that followed strategy sessions. A weekend working brunch that somehow stretched into evening. Nothing explicit. Nothing you could screenshot and wave around like proof. But I don't work with explicit threats. I work with patterns. At my firm, we teach executives that power leaves fingerprints. Not obvious ones. Subtle distortions in behavior. People start taking risks they don't need to take. They blur lines because they believe the rules bend for them. Claire had always believed that, long before Evan. I watched her get dressed for an industry mixer downtown, one I was expected to attend. She didn't ask if I was coming. She assumed it. My presence had always been part of her package, like a credential. A calm, older husband in corporate security who made investors relax. Proof of stability. That night, I told her I had a late compliance review. A half-truth. I did have work. I just didn't need to be there. She paused, just briefly, then nodded. Said she understood. Her tone carried something new. Not disappointment. Calculation. I arrived at the venue anyway, an hour later. Not to join her, but to observe. From the bar across the street, I could see the entrance. People I recognized moved in clusters. Consultants, founders, junior partners hoping to be remembered. Evan arrived alone. Nervous energy, overdressed, checking his phone too often. When Claire appeared, his posture changed. Shoulders back. Smile practiced. He followed her inside like gravity had shifted. That's when it became clear. This wasn't an affair built on secrecy or desire. It was performance. She was on stage, and he was part of the set. I didn't feel angry. Anger assumes betrayal. This felt more procedural. She had created a system where intimacy was a reward, and loyalty was tested through deprivation. I'd failed a test I hadn't agreed to take. So I stopped reacting. The next morning, I removed my name from a guest list she'd forwarded me. I declined a dinner with her partners, citing travel. I stopped asking how meetings went. When she spoke about Evan's startup, I listened without comment. In my world, when a control is abused, you don't break it. You isolate it. And slowly, you remove its audience. The first thing that changed was how quiet the apartment became. Not the comfortable kind of quiet. The performative kind. Claire started narrating less, sharing fewer details unless they reflected well on her. Wins, mentions, invitations. The things that needed witnesses. When I didn't ask follow-up questions, she filled the silence herself, like someone testing a microphone. At work, I began doing what I'd always done best. Background checks without names attached. Risk maps without conclusions. Evan Brooks' startup wasn't hard to understand once you stripped away the pitch language. Over-leveraged. Dependent on one major introduction that hadn't happened yet. His confidence wasn't arrogance. It was anticipation. I wasn't spying. I wasn't digging for dirt. I was doing what I do when a system starts misbehaving. I traced dependencies. Claire's power didn't come from authority. It came from context. From rooms she curated. From being seen with the right people at the right time. She didn't dominate conversations. She framed them. She decided who mattered by who stood next to her. I had been standing next to her for years. So I stepped aside. I stopped adjusting my schedule to match hers. When she mentioned a charity gala she was excited for, I said I had a conflict. When a partner dinner came up, I sent my regrets early, politely, with reasons no one could argue with. Travel. Internal audit. Regulatory prep. All true. Just not the whole truth. What I didn't do was replace myself. I didn't show up late. I didn't send a junior colleague. I simply wasn't there. People noticed. At first, they asked casually, "Where's Michael tonight?" "Busy," Claire would say, smiling. "He's swamped lately. Important work." She said it like a compliment, but it landed wrong. Without me there, the explanation felt thin. Evan started appearing more often at her side. Too often. He filled space, but he didn't anchor it. He talked too much. Laughed too quickly. He looked like someone auditioning for a role he thought he'd already earned. I watched the shift happen from a distance. Invitations addressed only to her. Follow-ups that didn't include me anymore. A subtle reclassification. At home, she tried a different approach. Not warmth. Not confrontation. Curiosity. She asked if everything was okay. If I was stressed. If work was getting to me. I said I was fine. Which was true. The moment came one evening when she dressed for an event and paused in the doorway, waiting. Not asking. Waiting. I didn't look up from my laptop. That was the first time I saw uncertainty cross her face. Insecurity, when a control stops responding, people assume it's broken. They don't realize it's been disconnected on purpose. Once I stepped out of her orbit, the pressure shifted. Claire began compensating in ways she didn't realize were visible. More posts. More tagged photos. More public gratitude for collaborations that hadn't needed it before. She was amplifying herself, trying to recreate the weight my absence had taken with it. At work, I started getting indirect signals. People I knew from compliance circles mentioning her name in passing. Asking how she was doing. Asking if I'd be at the conference in San Diego. I said no. Consistently. Calmly. Without explanation. That consistency mattered. Evan's presence grew louder as mine disappeared. He attended events he wasn't ready for. Spoke to people who weren't listening yet. He leaned on Claire in public ways that crossed professional lines, mistaking proximity for legitimacy. She let him. At first. From a systems perspective, it was predictable. When a lever stops working, people pull harder. Claire had turned intimacy into leverage with me. Now she was trying to convert proximity into leverage with everyone else. It didn't translate. I saw it in the seating arrangements. Evan placed at the edges instead of the center. Conversations that drifted away from him mid-sentence. Claire adjusting, recalibrating, smiling too precisely. At home, she grew restless. Not angry. Unsettled. She asked fewer questions, but watched more closely. She noticed when I came home late, and didn't mention where I'd been. When I stopped syncing my calendar. When my phone stayed face down on the counter. There was a night she cooked dinner. Proper dinner. Something she hadn't done in months. She talked about work in a softer tone, framed things as challenges instead of victories. She didn't mention Evan once. I thanked her. Ate. Cleaned up. Went back to my office. That was when she finally asked if she'd done something wrong. I told her no, which confused her more than an argument would have. In my line of work, Confusion is a signal. It means the model someone is using to predict outcomes no longer works. Claire was used to feedback, praise, resistance, negotiation. Silence wasn't part of her toolkit. A week later, an invitation arrived for a private investor dinner, addressed only to her. A subtle demotion. Spouse is optional, the note said. She showed it to me like it was nothing. I wished her luck and stayed home. That was the night she realized something irreversible had begun. Because leverage without witnesses doesn't generate power. It just exposes intent. And intent, once seen clearly, can't be unseen. The collapse didn't announce itself. It leaked. I noticed it first in the margins of her routine. Claire stopped asking if I'd be home for dinner and started asking when. Not in concern. In scheduling. As if my presence had become a variable she needed to account for again. At the same time, her confidence in public sharpened too much. She smiled longer, held eye contact harder. When someone questioned a recommendation she'd made, she defended it with an edge that hadn't been there before. People don't do that when they feel secure. They do it when they feel observed. Evan's name came up less at home and more everywhere else. Industry chatter has a way of circulating without trying. A founder leaning too heavily on one consultant. A pitch that sounded rehearsed instead of grounded. A sense that access was being traded instead of earned. I didn't contribute to that narrative. I didn't need to. One afternoon, I ran into a managing partner I'd known for years while grabbing coffee near my office. He asked how Claire was doing. Not casually, carefully. I told him she was busy. He nodded and changed the subject. That was confirmation enough. Claire began dressing differently for events. Less armor, more invitation. Softer lines. Familiar colors she used to wear when we first met. It wasn't about me. It was about restoring a version of herself she sensed was slipping. The irony was that she still believed this was a marital issue. Something between us that could be negotiated back into place. She hadn't realized the damage was happening offstage. The night she finally said my name like a question, I almost looked up. Almost. She stood in the doorway of my office, dressed but undecided, waiting for something she used to receive without asking. Approval. Alignment. Confirmation. I kept typing. She left without saying anything, and the door clicked shut with more force than necessary. The next week, she didn't get the follow-up call she expected from an investor she'd championed for months. Evan's startup was quietly moved to a later review cycle. No explanation. Just delay. Delay is fatal in her world. She came home earlier than usual that night. Sat at the kitchen table without turning on any lights. I could feel her watching me, trying to locate the moment where control had slipped out of her hands. What she didn't understand was that control hadn't been taken. It had been rendered irrelevant. Because leverage only works when someone agrees to stand where it can reach them. And I had already stepped out of range. The invitation that didn't arrive mattered more than the ones that did. Claire waited for it without admitting she was waiting. A panel she'd been informally promised. A closed-door session with 2 funds that never wasted time. When the confirmation didn't come, she told herself it was a scheduling glitch. Then a week passed. Then another. In my work, gaps are signals. Absence is rarely neutral. Evan's energy shifted next. Not away from her, but toward urgency. He started over-communicating, showing up unannounced, pushing timelines that couldn't be pushed. Founders do that when they sense support thinning. They don't panic loudly. They apply pressure where they think influence still exists. Claire absorbed it at first. Then she began carrying it home. Her questions changed tone. Less diagnostic, more personal. She asked how long I planned to stay distant. Used that word, distant, like a technical malfunction she expected me to fix. She framed it as concern, but the subtext was transactional. Alignment restored, benefits resume. I told her I was busy, which was still true. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been invited to a compliance symposium in Chicago. Quiet event. No press. No social media. The kind of room where reputations are formed without applause. I went alone. There, someone asked me how Claire was navigating the current climate. The phrasing was careful. I answered carefully too. I said she was capable. That she always had been. The pause that followed told me more than the question. When I came back, Claire had already heard something. Not details. Just tone. A shift in how people responded to her emails. A new distance in conversations that used to be warm. She didn't accuse me. She didn't ask what I'd said. She asked if I still believed in her. That question landed heavier than she intended. Belief implies risk. It implies shared consequence. What she was really asking was whether I'd resume standing beside her, absorbing the fallout of decisions she no longer wanted to own alone. I told her I believed she could handle whatever came next. It wasn't what she wanted to hear. The following week, Evan's startup lost its spot in a showcase she'd secured months earlier. No explanation, just reallocation. He stopped calling her by her first name in public, started using her title again. Distance creates hierarchy. Claire felt it. You could see it in how she stood at events now, no longer relaxed, measuring reactions, counting exits. Power doesn't disappear all at once. It erodes quietly, until the person holding it realizes there's no audience left to impress. The first public crack showed itself at a fundraiser she'd been planning for months. I knew about it because the invitation came addressed to both of us, then arrived again 2 days later, addressed only to her. Same event, same seat count, different assumptions. She showed me the second envelope like it was a joke. I smiled and said nothing. She went alone. From what I heard later, it was efficient, polite, cold. She did what she always did when pressure mounted. She performed competence. She shook the right hands. She laughed at the right moments. But without context, competence doesn't convert. It just exists. Evan didn't attend. He said he was out of town. The truth surfaced a week later when his startup announced a strategic pause on fundraising. That's what people call it when doors stop opening at the same time. Claire didn't mention it. She didn't mention him at all. At home, the apartment began to feel temporary, like a hotel room neither of us had booked intentionally. She started rearranging small things. Chairs, books, framed photos that had once included me, now angled slightly away. I recognized the behavior, reasserting ownership over territory when influence elsewhere fades. She asked if I was planning to leave. I told her I hadn't made any plans. That answer unsettled her more than a yes would have. In the weeks that followed, I declined 3 more events she'd expected me to attend. No drama, no explanations beyond professional obligations. Each absence removed a layer of insulation she'd grown used to. Without me there, she had to answer questions herself. She had to absorb reactions directly. People stopped asking about me eventually. That's when the tone shifted for her. Not hostile, neutral. Invitations that used to arrive early came late. Conversations ended faster. Introductions lost warmth. She wasn't excluded. She was deprioritized. She tried once more to reset things between us. Not with words. With proximity. She sat closer, touched my arm in passing. Soft gestures meant to signal alignment. I didn't pull away. I simply didn't move toward her either. That stasis told her everything she needed to know. Insecurity, when an asset no longer provides cover, you don't attack it. You stop routing risk through it. Claire had routed her authority through me for years. My silence rerouted the risk back to her. She stood in the kitchen one night, staring at nothing, and said she didn't recognize her own life anymore. I recognized it perfectly. It was what power looks like after the witnesses leave. The conversation she finally tried to have came too late to matter. Not because I was closed off, but because the structure she was speaking from no longer existed. She talked about distance like it was a phase, about recalibrating priorities, about how successful couples adapt. Her language was careful, professional, the same tone she used when smoothing over a partnership that wasn't delivering anymore. I listened. That was new for her. Listening without interruption used to mean agreement. When she finished, she waited. I told her she was right about one thing. Touch is an ode. That landed differently this time. I said respect worked the same way. Not demanded, not rationed. Earned through consistency, through not turning closeness into currency. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She went very still, like someone realizing the floor plan they'd memorized no longer matched the building. After that, she stopped trying to fix us and started trying to stabilize herself. She took meetings she would have declined months earlier. Accepted panels she once considered beneath her. Evan disappeared completely. Not dramatically, just quietly removed from her vocabulary, like a failed experiment no longer worth referencing. The industry moved on faster than she expected. It always does. At home, I became polite, predictable, absent in the most noticeable ways. I still lived there, but I no longer buffered her days. I didn't attend, didn't advise, didn't contextualize her decisions for anyone else. She felt the exposure immediately. One evening, she asked if I was seeing someone else. I said no. That answer didn't comfort her, because it meant this wasn't competition. It was consequence. A week later, she asked if I wanted a divorce. I told her I hadn't decided. That was the moment she understood the imbalance had reversed. Decisions were no longer hers to orchestrate. She could react. She could adjust. But she couldn't steer. In my field, we call that loss of control event horizon. Once crossed, recovery isn't impossible, but it requires humility. And humility had never been her strength. She started spending more time out, less time home, testing rooms, testing reactions, trying to locate the version of herself that still commanded attention. What she didn't see was that attention without context is just noise. I began planning my exit quietly. Not logistics. Identity. Where I'd re-anchor. Who I'd remain when her world stopped overlapping with mine. I wasn't leaving her. I was leaving the role she'd assigned me without consent. And that distinction mattered more than she knew. I didn't pack a bag. That would have looked like a decision, and decisions invite reaction. Instead, I began subtracting myself in ways that couldn't be argued with. I changed my gym schedule, moved my morning calls earlier, started taking dinners near my office instead of coming straight home. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual rerouting of presence. Claire noticed the pattern before she acknowledged it. She started asking where I was more often than how I was. Location mattered now. Proof of overlap. When I answered vaguely, she didn't push. Pushing would have meant admitting she was losing leverage, and she wasn't ready to name that yet. At work, things stabilized for me in a way they hadn't in years. Fewer distractions. More clarity. I accepted a long-term advisory role with a firm that valued discretion over visibility. No panels. No events. Just quiet authority. The kind that doesn't need witnesses. Claire's world kept shrinking in contrast. Not collapsing. Contracting. She still worked. Still attended. Still spoke confidently in rooms that remembered her name. But the after effects were gone. No follow-up buzz. No secondary calls. No invitations that assumed permanence. One night, she came home and asked if I remembered the first apartment we'd shared. She spoke like she was revisiting a version of herself she thought might still exist if she could just access it correctly. I said I remembered. She said she missed when things felt simple. I didn't correct her. Simplicity had never been the issue. Alignment had. A week later, I removed my name from our shared RSVP list for the rest of the quarter. Quietly. Administratively. The kind of change that doesn't trigger alarms until someone checks the system and realizes an assumption no longer holds. She found out when an assistant emailed her asking if she needed to update attendance. That was the night she understood I wasn't punishing her. I was disengaging. Disengagement doesn't argue. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't explain itself. It just withdraws energy until the structure relying on it has to stand on its own. She asked if I still cared. I said I cared enough not to pretend. That answer followed her longer than I expected. I signed a lease the next week. Temporary place. Clean lines. No history. I didn't tell her right away. There was no rush. Timing matters more than announcement. When I finally did mention it, I framed it as space. Not separation. Not divorce. Space removes friction. And friction was the only thing still connecting us. She nodded like she understood. But understanding isn't acceptance. Acceptance takes time. And I had already stopped waiting. The day I moved out, there was no argument, no confrontation, no closing statement. I packed what was mine early in the morning. Clothes. Books. A few framed photos that no longer fit the narrative of that apartment. I left the rest untouched. Space speaks louder when you don't override it. Claire watched from the doorway, arms crossed, posture controlled. She asked if this was permanent. I said it was necessary. Necessary is a word that doesn't invite negotiation. I didn't file for divorce. Not then. Paperwork would have turned it into a spectacle, and spectacle was the only currency she still believed in. Instead, I stepped fully out of her social field. I stopped being listed as her spouse. Stopped appearing in bios and introductions. When people asked about me, she answered vaguely. Consulting work. Busy schedule. Private projects. Each answer bought her time, but it didn't restore weight. Without me there, her authority had to stand alone. And alone, it looked different. I heard about the changes indirectly. A role she didn't get. A partnership that stalled. A quiet reshuffle at her firm that moved her sideways instead of up. Nothing catastrophic. Just a series of small recalibrations that added up to a message no one needed to say out loud. Power without validation doesn't vanish. It decays. Months passed. I settled into my new place. My work deepened. Fewer meetings. More trust. People came to me for answers, not optics. I slept better. Ate better. Lived lighter. Claire reached out once, late, asking if we could talk. I didn't refuse. I didn't rush either. Silence has its own timing. When we finally met, she looked composed, but older. Not in years. In certainty. She spoke about perspective. About mistakes. About how she'd misunderstood control for strength. I listened. Then I told her the truth she hadn't prepared for. I said intimacy stops being powerful the moment it's used as leverage. And respect, once converted into currency, never converts back. She didn't argue. There was nothing left to bargain with. I wished her well and stood up. I never heard about Evan again. Founders like him don't survive once the illusion of access disappears. They fade into pitch decks no one reads. As for Claire, she still attends events. Still speaks confidently. Still decides things. But now she does it without an audience that believes those decisions carry weight. And that was never my revenge. It was the outcome of leaving quietly. Some people think walking away is weakness. They've never seen what happens when the stage goes dark and the spotlight doesn't come back on. I didn't take anything from her. I just stopped giving her the one thing she needed most. Context. Real men don't explode. They exit. Subscribe for more power stories.